Hi everyone. In this video I am going to explain the servlet API. What is the servlet? What is generic servlet? What is HTTP servlet? And I am going to explain service method, init method, destroy method. These three methods called service, init, destroy are called lifecycle methods. You have to learn these three methods. Let us start with the interface that is at the top of the servlet package, javax.servlet.servlet. Basically, servlet is an interface from the package javax.servlet package. You can see that this is an interface. That means you cannot create an object for this. So basically, this defines the methods that need to be there in a servlet. So the service, init, destroy, get servlet config, get servlet info. So these are the 5 methods defined in the servlet interface. Out of these, the 3 service, which receives servlet request, servlet response, init method, which receives the servlet config object, destroy. These 3 are called lifecycle methods. And then get servlet config, get servlet info. So if you see, when we start the server, let us see when this init method gets called, when this service method gets called, when this destroy method gets called. But before that, we will continue to the other things, like this generic servlet is an abstract class. Okay, so you cannot create an object for this one also, but this generic servlet overrides the methods from the servlet interface. Okay, and it will add some more methods like get servlet context, get init parameter, get servlet context, log. Okay, in the coming videos we will discuss in detail, but the most important thing to learn are these lifecycle methods. How many times this init method gets called? Okay, this is the servlet interface. Generic servlet, it is an abstract class. You cannot create an object for this. HTTP servlet contains the HTTP related methods like do get, do post, do head, do options, do post, all those things. But generally, the most widely used are do get, do post. Okay, if you use get method, which is the default one, the do get method gets called by the container. If you specify post in the form like here in the JSP page, if you specify post, the do post gets called. Okay, this is also HTTP servlet is also an abstract class. You can't create object for this. So whenever you want to write a servlet, and if you want to send the request to that servlet, just extend this HTTP servlet. So all these methods are available to your new servlet. Okay, so when you want to write a servlet, just extend this HTTP servlet. Now comes into the picture when the servlet object gets created. Okay, there are 2 times, or there are 2 ways, or there are in 2 situations the servlet object is created. It can be created when the first request to the servlet is sent. Means whenever if the first request comes to the servlet, the container creates the servlet object. Suppose if you write hello world servlet, whenever you send the request, previously we have seen, right, how to send the request to the servlet. If you have followed my first video, you will understand that this is the way to send the request to the my first servlet, right? Can you see? So when the first request comes to the servlet, which servlet you have called? XYZ. XYZ means internally when the server is started, Tomcat reads all the information in the web.xml. It remembers all the content. It only reads one time the web content in the web.xml. If you modify this content after the server is started, it won't be reflected, because all this information is read during the startup. Means whenever the Tomcat is started, it reads all the web.xmls in the different web applications, and all that information will be remembered by the Tomcat. So when you send a request, first it reads this one. This means which web application, to which web application you are sending the request. In the Tomcat there can be multiple web application. In my case the request is for the first web application, means the hello world servlet project, and then when after the web application, this is called the servlet name. Okay, so already during the startup, the server, the Tomcat read this web.xml. So whenever it sees the content as XYZ in the URL, it goes to the servlet name, and it will find the servlet section with the name called hello world servlet. So it will find this line in the servlet section. Okay, then it understands that the request should be sent to the hello world servlet. Then if you see the hello world servlet, do get and do post, it receives the arguments request and response, which are of type HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response. But if you thought for a while, you may have got a question: who created these objects? That is where the Tomcat comes into picture. Whenever a request is sent to the servlet, it creates two objects and passes those request object and response object to the do get or do post, depending on the HTTP method used. If you use post method, it will create two objects, HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response, and passes those two objects into this do post method. Okay, understand? That is why these object references are not null. Understand? Okay. Now my question is, when your servlet object is created, when the servlet object can be created during the startup itself. We will discuss that during in the upcoming videos. There I will discuss load on startup tag. And for now, remember that whenever the first request comes to the servlet, like this, you may request, or some other user may request. So when the first request comes, the object for this hello world servlet will be created. Understand? And then after creating the HTTP servlet, the object for your servlet, then immediately this init method gets called. This init method gets called only once in the lifetime. Remember, whenever the first request comes to the servlet, or during the startup also, the object can be created by load on startup tag. The load on startup tag we will discuss later. For now, remember that the servlet object, the object for the servlet will be created when the first request comes to servlet. The same servlet, for the same servlet, thousands of requests can occur, but the servlet object, only one servlet object gets created. If you see, if you create hello world servlet, only there will be always only one object, servlet object. Okay, even you can send in this diagram, in this picture I have shown you only one request and one response, but to the servlet 1,000 users may send request to the servlet 1, but remember there will be only one object for each servlet. For one servlet there will be only one object. Remember that. For servlet 2, how many objects will be there? Only one object. For servlet 1, there will be only one object. Okay. Then, immediately after creating the object, init method gets called. Okay. Just after the servlet object is created, this method, init method, gets called by the tomcat or container, and then init method gets called only once. When that will be called? Just immediately after creating the servlet object, init method will be called. What is the purpose of init method? Means to get some startup related things which need to be used by the servlet. You can configure them in the init. We will discuss in detail, but remember that for one servlet there will be only one servlet object, and this init method gets called immediately after creating the servlet object. But this service method, if you see the service method, can you see this? The servlet, the constructor runs. When this will be executed? When the first request comes to the servlet, and then immediately init method gets called. But your service method gets called for every request. If you send 1,000 requests to servlet, then service method gets called 1,000 times, but init method gets called only one time, that is after immediately creating the servlet object. Init method executes only once in its lifetime. Even if you send 10,000 requests to the servlet, init method gets called only one time. Even if you send 10,000 requests, only one servlet object will be there. Remember, there may be hello world servlet 1, hello servlet world 2. For hello servlet world 1 class, only one object gets created. If you have 5 servlet classes, max how many objects will be created? Only 5 servlet objects will be created. All the 10,000 requests to the first servlet will be handled by only one servlet object. Remember, for each and every request, servlet object won't be created. Only one object will be created. In the same way, init method also gets called only once in its lifetime. But service, if you send 10 requests, the service method, if you see, but you may get doubt, I didn't write servlet service method, but you are saying that service method will get called on each request. Internally what will happen is the code in the service method is such that the service method finds whether the request is get or post. Remember, that logic will be already there. Okay, the service method from the service method reads if the request is get or post and calls the do get or do post. Okay, that is the reason I didn't write service method, but internally service method contains the logic to check whether the HTTP method is get or post. If the HTTP method is get, the service method calls do get. If the HTTP method is post, the service calls do post. Okay, so every time you send a request to the servlet, service method performs this check. It checks the get or post and calls do get or do post respectively. Okay, so in the lifetime, if you call 1000 times, the servlet service method gets called 1000 times, but init method only one time. In the same way, destroy method also gets called only one time. When it will get called, when you deploy, undeploy means if you stop the server, the destroy method gets called. Okay, it will get the time during the you will write code to clean up, means generally you will if you use some file related operations, you will close the file, right? Like file buffer writer dot close, something like that, because you have to close the resources in the finally in the like that. In the destroy method you will get a chance to clean those resources, valuable resources. You can put destroy method and init method gets called only once in the lifetime. Remember, init method gets called immediately after the servlet object is created, means the constructor is run. Once the constructor runs for the servlet, this init method gets called immediately. Okay, but when this servlet object will be created, this object gets created during the first request, or there is another scenario. If you specify load on startup, then during the server startup itself, it will create the object for the servlet. If you specify load on startup for a servlet, at that time, even before the request comes, the servlet object gets created. But if you don't specify load on startup, then the servlet object gets created only when the first request comes. Okay, so the init method receives, if you see this picture, whenever the request comes, the container creates request response object and it passes those two objects to the do get or do post. Okay, if you see, there is something called servlet config and there is something called servlet context. These two are very important. We will discuss those two in the upcoming videos, but I will discuss in few minutes about these two things before I wrap up this video. For every servlet, there will be one servlet config object. Okay, so if you have 5 servlets, then 5 servlet config objects will be created. That servlet config object will be created by the container, and that servlet config object is passed to the init method. Okay, right after the servlet object is created, init method gets called, right? The container will call the init method by passing the servlet config object. Remember, if you have 5 servlets, 5 servlet config objects will be there, but how many servlet context objects will be there means, for entire web application, if you see this picture, there are 2 web applications. This is one web application, this is second web application. For this web application, there will be one servlet context object. For this web application, there will be another servlet context object. That means for per web application, there will be only one servlet context. So for this web application, one servlet context object will be there. For this web application, one servlet context object will be there. But servlet config is different from servlet context. For this servlet, there will be one config object. For this servlet, there will be one servlet config object. So for every servlet, you will have, for every servlet, you have one servlet config object. For every servlet config, you will have one object. But for the entire web application, there will be only one servlet context object. That means for the entire web application, there will be only one servlet context, whereas servlet config will be per servlet. Hope you understand. Thank you. We will see the details of servlet context, servlet config, all those things in upcoming videos. Thank you.